Bloomberg. Or anybody else spending hundreds of millions of dollars trying to buy an election. And that is why we're going to overturn this disastrous Citizens United Supreme Court decision.
This is Sanders getting his supporters riled up in Nevada. Now, as you notice, this was a full house, full crowd. And he's been bringing these full crowds all across the United States. The wild part is they have a Nevada caucus coming up next week on Saturday. And to some degree, I guess Sanders understands that one of his main opponents, not in that specific caucus, but just in general in this election, is going to be Bloomberg. You have this naked expression of a war in the Democratic Party. This belief by the billionaire class that the Democrats no longer can be trusted to represent their interests, so much so that the guy jumps into the race in this naked show of oligarchy, just outright buying the race. Well, Sanders is going after him. This, if I'm being honest though, is where Sanders to some degree sometimes is at his weakest. Bloomberg and the attacks on Bloomberg, yes, should be level in the sense of policy. Yes, it should be level in the sense of he's buying the election. But the guy is a racist oligarch, and the notion that we're going to trade one billionaire racist for another billionaire racist seems to be rather pointless to me, and that point should be hit home. Not to mention the fact of the sexual charges, of the accusations filed against him and the stuff. He's a litany of these things, even more than Trump. He almost doubles Trump on this notion. So these attacks should be leveled in a little bit more round, contextual way that goes entirely beyond this notion of just policy. But nevertheless, Sanders is in Nevada and he's going after Bloomberg. On the positive news, the Nevada caucuses are jam-packed. These are the lines. 4 hours long. 4 hours long. Because Nevada has early voting this year. Now, when I say Nevada has early voting, a few things should jump to mind. A, oh my God, why do these people have to wait 3-4 hours in a line for any election, let alone for early voting? That's one question. That's a damn good question. The second question, though, is Nevada is a caucus. How is a caucus going to early vote? Because understand, in a caucus, you guys get together in a room, you guys bitch and moan and fight, and you push your candidate, they push their candidate, and at some point you take a vote. If one of the candidates or multiple candidates don't get at least 15% of the vote, those people can move on to go to somebody else's campaign, in which case you get a first and second round vote tally. It's a caucus, right? So how do you do that in early voting? So right off the bat, it's a head scratcher. Well, the way they're going to do this is effectively ranked choice voting, where you can choose multiple candidates. With a catch, if you don't add in at least 3, they're going to get rid of that ballot. And again, we're at this weird situation in Nevada that is still in the light or in the shadow of Iowa that was an outright dumpster fire. Now, when I make the point that Iowa should not be looked at absent context, meaning the fact of what took place in 2016 from a Democratic Party that cheated the guy, outright cheated the guy, while simultaneously telling people, oh, you guys are just being bitter that you're losing, and there's nothing to see here, and we're fair, we're honest, we're impartial, and you find out that they were not fair and honest and impartial. In fact, you found out either through WikiLeaks, you found out even through Donna Brazile herself, who was head of the Democratic National Committee, you found out through multiple sources that they were gaming the system. Did they ever own up to that? No. They went in court and said, we can cheat a man and we can lie in a smoke-filled room and pick a candidate in a smoke-filled room if we want. And they used that as a defense against this notion of fraud. That party is the exact same party that is running the elections in 2020. How am I supposed to look at what is taking place in 2020 as if the 2016 context doesn't exist? Truth of the matter is, incompetence is often used as a dodge to cover up issues of malfeasance. And for a party that has brazenly lied, brazenly cheated, never owned up to the fact that they were lying and cheating, tried to make it look like there was an appearance of impropriety, not necessarily the impropriety in and of itself, which means that even on best of occasions, you have a credibility issue. And to have that credibility issue, and you take that credibility issue into Iowa, and you perform the Iowa caucus in the way it was performed, it is a weird perspective for me to take, or for anybody to take, at least from my perspective, that there was no malfeasance here. It just seems like all of the errors went to benefit Pete. You have a situation where one of the top Pete staffers was working at a company that was supposed to be tallying the votes. You have a weird incestuous relationship from the standpoint of Hillary staffers who are running this company that is supposed to be, again, tallying votes. Now, Pete Buttigieg has a fiscal relationship with the company that is supposed to be, again, tallying these votes. There are pictures of him, or let's say people within the context of his campaign, the people who are supposed to be tallying the votes, meaning that company, and also the Democratic chair, all together, one happy family. And what happened? All of the errors in that particular race went to the detriment of Sanders, and in this case, to the benefit of Pete. The app collapsed and failed outright, all the way through. And you had a situation where they would come out and say, no, look, yes, the app failed, but the results are accurate. That only lasted for maybe an hour or so until it became clear that the results weren't accurate, that they were putting votes that belonged to Sanders into Patrick Duvall, or Duvall Patrick and Tom Steyer's accounts. My point is, one failure after the next, and those failures cut in the direction of Sanders. And the notion that I'm supposed to look at 2020 Iowa, where they dripped information out to give Pete this appearance of a win with two objectives: to kill and eliminate, or at the very least try to restrain any level of bump Sanders was going to get out of winning Iowa outright, while simultaneously allowing Pete to declare a win that he never actually received, and having the newspapers and the media follow this around with dripping information out, allowing this to be a story for multiple days. And I and other lefties are supposed to walk away from this thinking it's just incompetence. It was all a mistake. It was all a coincidence. That is nonsense. It stunk from the get-go. And if it stunk from the get-go and you find out that the results are so mangled that it may be impossible to even determine who actually won, and yet, again, Pete got his bump, meaning he got the results of a win, even if he didn't necessarily win it in and of himself. And I'm supposed to look at a process that looked like it was going to stink, ends up stinking, and then call it just a coincidence. Not so much. Nevada was supposed to use the exact same application that Iowa ended up using. Now, Nevada pulled out of using that particular app, but Nevada has several problems associated with it. Right off the bat, you're seeing the start of a clusterfuck. And just like in Iowa, and just like in 2016, when there are mistakes to be had, and there's some level of human agency that can be added into the process to push it one way or the other, it invariably goes against the person who the party hates the most. What has been going on in Nevada recently with the culinary union attacking Sanders outright and the other Democrats lumping in on those particular attacks? On the positive, the fact that they have a huge amount of numbers, Sanders' theory of the case is that if we could expand the field, we are going to win because we're bringing in new voters. I think that theory of the case is to some degree right. By the same token, these are 3-4 hour lines, and that's pre-voting. And what is Saturday going to look like on an application that these people apparently haven't been trained on, haven't necessarily used, going to end up using ranked choice voting and have to do all of this stuff pretty much in the moment. I'm going to show you a clip from a gentleman who, Seth Morrison. He was a Nevada caucus chair, or Nevada caucus head at one of the sites, at one of the precincts. And I'm going to let you hear the way he explains it. And I'm going to also let you hear somebody who was actually on the scene at one of these 4-hour lines for pre-voting, and let him explain to you his experience so far going into Nevada. We have, 5 days left before we get to the Nevada caucuses, and Nevada is already a clusterfuck. Welcome to the Soapbox. My name is Jamal Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, subscribe. You can always support PayPal or Patreon. Tomorrow is the first day of Political Misfits. That show will go from 12 to 2. You can, 105.5 if you're in Washington, D.C. or in the Maryland area. But any show that we do on the radio is going to be pumped through this particular site. We're going to have all sorts of guests, and you guys are absolutely free to call in. So that's 12 to 2 p.m. Eastern, Political Misfits. I think you guys are going to love it. So far, Bob and I seem to do really well together. And we're still, tweaking and everything else. But for the most part, the show seems to be pretty consistent. However, before we move on to anything else, I have to hit I have to hit Nevada. Freudian slip. Because I strongly think that Iowa or Nevada is going to end up looking to some degree like Iowa. We are in the shadow of the Iowa dumpster fire that we're calling a caucus. We still don't know the results of that particular election. We do know that it looked like all sorts of malfeasance was incorporated into the way that they ran that process, either from the standpoint of the Democratic chair in that state, who seemed to have done bending over backwards to help Pete Buttigieg get a bump, and not just necessarily a bump, but in arbitrary ways that these things were being counted. And now we're moving into Nevada, where it seems like we have just as many choke points and just as many issues, even if they aren't necessarily using that shadowy app, Shadow. Listen to the Democratic site leader explain what's taking place in Iowa. And listen to the gentleman who's asking him questions, whose mouth is on the floor, as to oh my God, I can't believe that this is what you guys are about to do.
Early voting starts today. Organizers have had a significant amount of time to get ready for the caucuses. How far along in the training are you? Are other volunteers? Are you as confident?
I'm not quite as confident, but they've been working very hard. And I am personally really encouraging early voting, because early voting will minimize many of the risks that we'll be talking about. It is accurate that we're not using an app per se, but we are using an untested software tool in the caucus room. And I do worry that the caucus process will be confusing and flawed.
When you say untested, and I apologize if it sounds like I'm cutting you off because we've got a delay. When you say untested, how's the training going on this new process?
We have had a lot of training on the broad process. We have never seen or handled this tool.
Oh, wow.
They keep telling us as early as last night that we'll show it to you when it is ready.
So it's not ready a week out.
That's what the trainers have said as recently as yesterday.
So let me ask you about...
Just so we're clear, this is a race that we're using to determine who's going to run for president of the United States. Let me repeat that. This is not for dog catcher. I wouldn't care so much if this was for dog catcher of the year or something, but this is not for dog catcher of the year. This is for president of the United States. Who's going to run in the general election to determine who's going to run the quote unquote leader of the free world, as they like to call it. And they are knowingly pushing through an app that hasn't been tested a week out to the primary. And I hate to tell people, when he said the early voting thing, I've just shown you the lines for early voting were 3-4 hours long. And that doesn't entirely solve the issue. They're early voting in a state with a caucus, which means for all intents and purposes, this is ranked choice voting. So the person has to put down their first choice, second, third, fourth, and fifth choice, because they're not necessarily going to know who's going to either win or lose, meaning they don't know whether or not their candidate is going to get the 15% threshold, so you're going to need first, second, third, and fourth. Now, when those people drop off the ballot and leave, those people are going to have to trust that the Democratic Party, who currently lacks credibility in running elections, trusts that they allocate those votes correctly and that the ranked choice voting process is done accurately. And how do you determine that? And by the way, all of this has to be done on Saturday because those votes for the ranked choice voting is somehow going to have to interact with the actual caucus itself. Both of those things are going to have to run in tandem together, and they're going to have to work in sync. This is kind of my point when I say when there are potentials for screw-ups, those screw-ups tend to go in a direction that hits the person who they like the least. The person who they like the least seems to be Sanders. Let's let him finish. I'm not going to play the entirety of the video again.
About the early voting, because this is the first time for Nevada that an early vote will be part of the caucus process. I don't know of another state that offers it, so maybe the first time in the country. How does something like a static ballot, and we've got a sample ballot we can put up, work in something as dynamic as a caucus?
Well, first of all, I strongly compliment the party for doing this because caucuses are by nature horrible. They are not truly democratic. So what they are going to do is you simply say, my first choice is A, my second is B, and my third is C. By the way, if you forget to put all three, your ballot is not valid. But
and you can write up to 5, right?
You can write up to 5. But what software is being used to tally? And think of all the permutations. I voted for A as my first choice. You voted for B, but A is not viable. So who's my second choice? So the permutations of all of this are complicated. And we don't know who developed that software.
So let me...
Right, like, this should be a mind-blowing interview. Notice, he said 2 things, both of which sound like they contradict, but they don't really contradict. It's just that one is a lesser potential for fuck-up than the other one that seems to be a major potential for fuck-up. He says, I think people should vote early. Great. We should pre-vote. And the gentleman, the newsman, says, yes, and I want to ask you about that. How is that going to work in the context of a caucus? He says, well, I mean, you have to put all of these different vote tallies. And he says, and again, he's recommending this option. He says, and, you know, it has to get all of those permutations right. And we don't know who developed that software. It's like, wait, so you want us to engage yourself in the process where A, we don't know who developed the software, B, there's a lot of permutations, meaning the potential for errors are going to be pretty high, especially since this wasn't something that Nevada has done before. And C, let's go back to the credibility issue that we're supposed to trust the Democratic Party that was instrumental in working with the app developer in Iowa, despite Tom Perez pretending like the DNC didn't have anything to do with it, and instrumental in working with one of the other campaigns to try to shaft the person who's running in this particular election also. Like, all of this has problems associated with it. The best case scenario was that last scenario of going in and voting early. Red alert. Red alert. Red alert. And if I'm not mistaken, these guys are like volunteers. These are volunteers.
Let me ask you this. I got 2 more questions on this early ballot because it's fascinating how I guess you all think this is going to work. I see problems just in knowing caucuses and what this piece of paper is going to represent. So how will people in the caucus room, in person, right? Viability is 15%, whatever that number is. How will I know how many votes any candidate has in early votes toward viability?
We're counting on this untested tool that we haven't been trained on. And if it doesn't work, when I asked in the training, they said, quote, call us.
Call us.
So I'm going to call us. And while my 100 people are milling around and talking, I, as the caucus chair, have to figure out, either on the phone or on this tool, all these numbers. That's why I strongly encourage early voting, because at least it's on a piece of paper, and they've done ranked choice voting in a few states. The software exists, the processes exist.
Well, Seth.
All right, I'm going to stop him there, because I think he gets across a certain level of abject terror, like, look, I'm unfamiliar with this. My people are unfamiliar with this. We haven't used this before. I think people should just vote early. Saturday is going to be problematic. Vote early. There's a gentleman who went to one of the Nevada caucuses, Dan Roll. Listen to how he describes it. I'm not going to play his entire video, but I'm going to play the part where he gets into certain choke points and problems that are associated with the caucus that he's seen just in interacting with this. And he's sounding what he's calling the red alert.
So this is choke point A. The ballot that you enter doesn't have your precinct on it. Percent accuracy from the person entering the information to the form to your voter pin, right? I want to be honest with you. I think that's a choke point that should be causing us major concern. Choke point number 2. There's no like scanning of the ballot. None of it is like a scanned ballot. It's you fill it out, you literally handwrite your information on the ballot, and you put it in a box at the end of the row. There are so many potential challenges there that I see, but here is the here is why I am predicting and I'm willing to be held accountable to what is going to happen on Saturday. The Nevada Democratic Party has got to get all of these early votes in ranked choice, which is the first time they've ever done this. They've got to get all of that math to the caucus sites on the 22nd. And on the caucus sites, a volunteer who has been trained by the party is going to have to figure all of that out in live time, in real time. And if the training is anything like I saw today, you should be concerned. Now, somebody just said they use a Google form for that. Well, let me tell you what's happening. So yes, some of the sites were using the Google form at the caucus site today, at the early caucus site. But at our caucus site, they scrapped the Google form. Nobody was using the form. They were just taking the ballot and putting it into the box. That's all they did. Now, yes, it's true they will have a Google form at the site on caucus day. However, we're assuming, like, let's say worst case scenario. Actually, let's go best case scenario. Best case scenario, they've got an army of people, which they don't, an army of people that's going to take the ballot out, match everything up, make sure everything is good to go, tally the votes, tally the ranked 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's pre-math. Tally all of that up, and then get it sent to the caucus site. That's your best case scenario. That assumes that the person is well trained at the caucus site on Saturday to take that information, to input it, and to correctly tabulate it in the waves of ranked choice, aka viability voting. So you do the rounds of voting. Do you have a certain percent? Do you have a certain percent? Do you have a certain percent? No. Go to the next round. Go to the next round. Go to the next round. And they're all trying to figure this out on caucus day with no training. Well, there's not no training, that's fair. With poor training and an entirely volunteer staff base. But there's still time to put the pressure on. What the right thing to do right now, the Nevada Dems and the DNC should invest and hire as many people as they can. Paid staffers with integrity, sign NDAs, get them trained, spend from today until Saturday training them, do overtime, $15 an hour, $20.
Now, I agree with him. I agree with him. Rational human being. Hey, this looks really dodgy. I mean, it looks like these guys don't know what they're doing in regards to getting all these values, and there are a lot of errors or points where errors can crop up in this, especially when you get into the context of training. You've heard the other gentleman who was behind the scenes in this case, meaning one of the people who were one of the site leaders, who was freaking out, meaning the person who's going in order to place this vote, this gentleman, is effectively saying the exact same thing of this gentleman. Their stories merge, even though they're on slightly different sides of this particular process. I have no reason to disbelieve either one of them. He doesn't come across as if he's trying to put a knife in the Democratic Party. And the other gentleman comes across as if he's, what's the gentleman's name? Dan Roll. He comes across as if it's like, whoa, we need to ensure this process is accurate. And there are several problems with the way this process is going into operation. I agree with both of them. And I particularly agree with this one, the notion that pressure needs to be applied in order to make sure that they have a fair and earnest process. But again, that's assuming that the goal and the objective is to have a fair and earnest process. I don't think that was true in Iowa, and I'm not necessarily certain that's true here. If there is a potential for errors, I think those potential for errors is where fudging takes place, where it cuts one way or cuts a particular way where it injures or hampers or hurts, or at the very least undermines a particular candidate. And in this very particular situation, I have zero trust or zero reason to give the Democratic Party a certain degree of credibility or trust that they are going to run this process fair and honestly. What it looks like is a dumpster fire is about to take place. And looking at the lines already, early voting, and you have 4-hour lines, what on earth is Saturday going to look like? It's not a situation where nobody was saying anything. It's not a situation that they didn't necessarily know. It's not a situation where Iowa hasn't already happened, meaning you can look at what was taking place in Iowa to come away with the conclusion, hey, maybe we need to do this process slightly differently. And it doesn't seem to matter. We're still on path for a train wreck on Saturday. I'll leave this here. I don't want this to be long, and the video has already gone 26 minutes. But what is taking place right now in Iowa is problematic. I keep calling it Iowa. I keep calling it Iowa because to some degree it comes across like Iowa to me, or the very least in the way that Iowa fell apart. But we'll see. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they get their stuff together within the context of just a very few short days, meaning in 2 or 3 days the people are trained and they're ready to go in Iowa, and there's no screw-ups in Nevada. Maybe. But there's nothing in me that leaves me with that particular analysis. Scream, howl, point. Right now, Nevada is looking like a clusterfuck. The question becomes, does the Democratic Party allow it to stay that way? Or do they do something to change the trajectory? Like, share.